In 1965, African Americans made up 11% of all American military personnel in Vietnam. That same year, they filled 31% of the ground combat battalions and suffered 24% of the United States Army's fatal casualties. Those three numbers, sitting next to each other, tell you almost everything you need to know about what being a black grunt in Vietnam actually meant. Not as a political statement, not as a historical footnote, but as a mathematical reality that the Department of Defense's own records confirm, and that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was publicly naming in 1967 as a white man's war being fought by black men's bodies. Today, we're going inside that reality. The draft system that delivered black men to the front lines in disproportionate numbers. The jungle where they bled alongside men who wouldn't acknowledge their humanity back at the base. The places inside Vietnam they carved out for themselves when the military's version of America became intolerable. And the homecoming that was in many ways the hardest part of the entire experience. This isn't commentary. It's documented history that the standard Vietnam War narrative has been consistently too comfortable to examine at full scale. Start with how they got there, because the draft is where the story of the Black Grunt actually begins. Not in the jungles of Quang Tri or the Mekong Delta, but in county courthouse offices across the South, and in northern cities where local draft boards were making decisions that sent men to die. The Selective Service System operated through local draft boards, civilian bodies that made induction decisions for the men in their districts. These boards had enormous discretionary power. They approved and denied deferments. They classified men into draft-eligible or exempt categories. They decided in practice who went to Vietnam and who didn't. The board system had been designed to give local communities control over military manpower decisions. What it actually did was give local racial hierarchies institutional power over who got sent to war. In 1966, African Americans accounted for slightly more than 1% of all draft board members nationally. 7 state boards had no black representation whatsoever. In Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Arkansas, states with substantial black populations, the boards were almost uniformly white. The deferment system compounded this. College attendance offered a path out of the draft, and that path was overwhelmingly accessible to white middle-class and upper-class men whose families could afford tuition and who had access to universities that weren't actively restricting black enrollment. Working-class men, black and white, went to Vietnam in numbers that bore no relationship to the proportion of those communities in the general population. Black working-class men went at rates that those numbers still don't fully capture because the deferment that college provided was available in theory to anyone, but in practice required money, access, and institutional support that black men in 1965 were dramatically less likely to have. The result was a draft pool skewed in ways that the military's own subsequent analysis documented clearly. Approximately 300,000 African Americans served in the Vietnam War. During the height of U.S. involvement from 1965 through 1969, black people comprised 11% of the American population and 12.5% of the soldiers in Vietnam. The majority of these were in the infantry. The Pentagon's own data shows that in 1966, while 11% of the U.S. fighting force in Vietnam was black, African Americans made up 17.8% of overall combat deaths. In the early phases of the war, some documented reports showed black soldiers accounting for as much as 25% of casualties recorded in 1965. Black men in the military were dying 60% faster than the overall rate. President Johnson, facing protests from civil rights leaders, including King, ordered a cutback in the number of African Americans assigned to combat positions. By 1969, the black casualty rate had dropped to 11.5%, proportional to population, finally. But that adjustment came after years of documented disproportionality, and it came through political pressure from the civil rights movement, not from any institutional recognition within the military that something had been systematically wrong. The mechanism that funneled black soldiers into combat roles rather than technical or support positions was the Armed Forces Qualification Test. The AFQT measured aptitude in ways that reflected educational opportunity rather than inherent ability, and black soldiers, educated in chronically underfunded, segregated, or de facto segregated schools, consistently scored lower than their white counterparts on a test designed around a curriculum those schools weren't providing. Lower AFQT scores meant assignment to the military occupational specialties that required the least technical training and the most physical exposure to enemy fire. The infantry, the grunts, the men who walked point through the jungle. Project 100,000 locked this mechanism into place and expanded it deliberately. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara launched the program in October 1966, officially to bring opportunity and training to men who hadn't previously qualified for military service. Between October 1966 and June 1969, 246,000 soldiers entered the military through Project 100,000's lowered standards. 41% of them were black, in a military where black people comprise 11% of the general population. Because Project 100,000 men received minimal specialized training, the infrastructure to train large numbers of low-scoring recruits in technical specialties wasn't built, and the demand for infantry in 1966 and 1967 was acute, they were sent to the infantry in disproportionate numbers. Project 100,000 soldiers died at rates significantly higher than average GIs. The program, designed to offer opportunity, functioned in practice as a mechanism to direct poor and minority men toward the most dangerous assignments in the war. Once they were in the jungle, the picture that emerged was one that Wallace Terry spent years documenting in the testimony collected in Bloods. It was a picture of men fighting with complete commitment and professionalism alongside white soldiers in combat, returning to base camps where those same white soldiers flew Confederate flags, where promotions materialized more readily for white NCOs and officers, and where the 2% of the officer corps that was black represented not just a number, but the ceiling of an institutional hierarchy that hadn't been genuinely integrated regardless of what the order said. The combat itself was its own equalizer. Terry documented repeatedly that in the jungle, under fire, race often dissolved into something more immediate and more human. The man in the foxhole next to you was your survival, regardless of what color he was, and black soldiers described moments of genuine brotherhood in the field that made the base camp reality more, not less, jarring when they returned to it. You bled the same. You died the same. Then you walked back to the base and someone had a Confederate battle flag over their bunk. The cognitive dissonance of that, the gap between what those soldiers had just lived through together and what the flag meant, is documented across multiple veteran testimonies in Terry's work and Westheider's scholarship. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army understood this gap and deliberately exploited it. Leaflets dropped in jungle areas where black units were operating addressed black soldiers directly, telling them their real war was at home, that they were fighting for a country that was killing their people in the streets. Radio broadcasts, including from the broadcast of the Hanoi propaganda operation, covered previously on this channel, spoke directly to the racial contradictions of black soldiers dying in Southeast Asia while black Americans were being beaten at lunch counter sit-ins and marching in cities that would erupt in flames the following summer. These messages were not converting black soldiers to communism, but they were naming, loudly and specifically, the exact contradiction that those soldiers were already living, and the military had no effective counterargument to offer. April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. The news traveled through the military in Vietnam the way all news traveled in that war, through armed forces radio, through Stars and Stripes, through letters from home, through the particular silence of men absorbing something they couldn't process. The reaction on U.S. military bases in Vietnam was documented by Wallace Terry in his contemporaneous reporting for Time magazine. Across the country, across the bases, racial tensions that had been accumulating for years broke open. Racial confrontations that had been managed, barely, through the pressure of combat and the shared necessity of survival, went unmanaged. According to later New York Times reporting, there were large-scale battles between black and white soldiers in service clubs in 1968. Racial incidents occurred at the China Beach recreation area and in Da Nang clubs and dining halls on what witnesses described as an almost daily basis. Long Binh Jail, LBJ as the soldiers called it, an acronym they applied to both the military stockade outside Saigon and the president who had sent them to Vietnam, was the pressure vessel where all of this converged. The stockade had been built to house 400 inmates. By August 1968, it held 719 men. Despite representing 11% of the troops in Vietnam, black soldiers made up more than 50% of the men incarcerated at LBJ. The reason soldiers were there covered the full spectrum of military justice. Serious violent offenses at one end, and at the other, infractions as minor as refusing a direct order to get a haircut. Over half were being held on AWOL charges by the summer of 1968. Jimmy Childress was one of them. He had been given a choice by a Kansas City judge in 1967, military or prison. He chose the military, was trained as a paratrooper, assigned to the 101st Airborne Division, and sent to Vietnam. After months of combat, he went AWOL. He spent months underground in the Vietnamese countryside and in Saigon's Seoul Alley before being caught and sent to LBJ. Sitting in the stockade after King's assassination, Childress described the question that hung over every black soldier there. Why am I even over here when you can't even go back to America and sit at a lunch counter? Close to midnight on August 29, 1968, he and a group of other black inmates overpowered the guards, tore down sections of the stockade with homemade weapons and bare hands, and set buildings on fire. Childress went specifically for the administrative building. He burned the records. The uprising at Long Binh Jail on August 29, 1968, made a few headlines and then disappeared from most Vietnam War histories. The people who were there didn't talk about it publicly for decades. Seoul Alley existed before the Long Binh uprising and outlasted it. Time magazine documented it in December 1970 in a piece that described a 200-yard backstreet in Saigon located exactly 1 mile from U.S. military headquarters. At high tide, when things were relatively calm, between 300 and 500 black AWOLs and deserters lived there. Green army fatigues dried on balcony railings. A barbershop sign read, "The natural look has arrived." The bars played Aretha Franklin and soul music. There was a restaurant called Nam's that served food nobody was serving anywhere else in Saigon. The policy for white soldiers who wanted to enter was simple. You came with a black soldier who vouched for you, or you didn't come in. The military police knew Seoul Alley existed. They had known for years before the Time magazine piece was published. The stockade had been full of men who'd been pulled from it. What they couldn't do was treat it as a routine enforcement problem, because 2 MPs found out what the alternative looked like when their Jeep strayed in during an ordinary morning. They walked back out 5 minutes later without their Jeep and without their weapons. The incident that Time magazine used as the lead for its 1970 piece, a raid that swept up 110 GIs, including 30 deserters, was described as the biggest raid the Army had staged there. After it was done, according to the reporting, the residents, rather like the Viet Cong, drifted back. Seoul Alley reopened. A year later, contemporary news footage confirmed it was back in operation. The men who lived in Seoul Alley were not having a good time by any honest accounting. The Time magazine reporting was careful about this. Many would rather have been home but couldn't leave Vietnam without facing arrest and court-martial. The handshake system that black soldiers developed in the late 1960s, complex, choreographed sequences of chest slaps, fist taps, finger snaps, and grip variations that could run for minutes between 2 men who knew the full sequence, was simultaneously a greeting, a cultural statement, a trust signal, and a genuine source of institutional panic for white officers who could not read it, and therefore could not control it. The DAP was described by its practitioners as standing for dignity and pride. It spread through Vietnam in 1969 and 1970, particularly among soldiers influenced by the Black Power movement and the broader cultural shift in Black American identity that was reshaping everything from music to politics back home. It was visible. It was elaborate. It was performed with deliberate and unhurried care in places where military bearing required economy of motion and conformity of behavior, and it was, by its nature, legible only to those who participated in it, which meant that every performance of the DAP was a reminder to every white officer watching that black soldiers had a language the officer corps couldn't access. The military's response was to ban it. Court-martial charges were filed against soldiers for performing the DAP. Disciplinary actions were taken. The institutional terror driving this response was documented by Wallace Terry, whose reporting for Time magazine during and after the war recorded officer after officer describing the DAP as a potential coded signal for black nationalist organizing or mutiny. It was black soldiers organizing a cultural practice that the institutional hierarchy had no mechanism to absorb or control, in a military that had spent its entire existence absorbing and controlling every dimension of soldier behavior. What none of this erases, and what the black soldiers who served in Vietnam consistently insisted upon in their testimony, is that they fought. They fought with a commitment and professionalism that is documented in the medals, in the after-action reports, in the casualty figures of the units they served in. 20 Medal of Honor recipients from the Vietnam War were African American. They served at every level of the conflict, in every theater, in every role the military required of them. They did this while simultaneously fighting the second war, the one inside the uniform, inside the base camp, inside the draft board offices back home that had decided their addresses on the class and race map made them expendable. The homecoming closed the trap. They returned to a country that had changed in their absence. The civil rights legislation of 1964 and 1965 had passed. The formal architecture of legal segregation was being dismantled. But the economic and social reality that met black Vietnam veterans was not the reality the legislation had promised. Urban unemployment among black Vietnam veterans reached documented highs of up to 30% in some cities in the early 1970s. The VA routinely delayed and denied disability and PTSD claims submitted by black veterans through the 1970s, with documented disparities in both processing times and approval rates. The GI Bill offered educational benefits that required navigating application processes, university admission systems, and tuition costs that continued to be structured against men who had come from exactly the kind of backgrounds that made navigation difficult. The same demographics that had made black men more likely to be drafted, more likely to fail the AFQT, and more likely to be assigned to the infantry, now made them less likely to successfully convert military service into the educational and economic advancement the GI Bill was theoretically offering. And they carried PTSD at documented rates higher than their white counterparts. Not because the jungle was different for them. The terror of a firefight doesn't sort by race. But because PTSD in the Vietnam veteran literature is understood to be amplified by the pre-existing conditions of stress, marginalization, and trauma that a person brings into combat. Men who had grown up under Jim Crow, who had watched their neighborhoods treated as occupied territory by police, who had been told throughout their lives that their lives were worth less. Those men went into combat already carrying a psychological load that the jungle then added to. They came back carrying both, to a country that had no treatment infrastructure for either. Martin Luther King had called Vietnam a white man's war, a black man's fight in 1967. The phrase captured what the statistics confirm, and with the testimony in Bloods documents in voice after voice. Men who went because the draft gave them no choice, who fought because their character gave them no other way to do it, and who came home to discover that the country that had sent them had not changed its fundamental accounting of their worth while they were gone. The Wall in Washington has 58,000 names on it. 7,262 of those names belong to black soldiers. Of that total, 96% were Army and Marine enlisted men. Officers, technical specialists, and support personnel are nearly absent from that portion of the count because black soldiers were nearly absent from those roles. And they were there in numbers that no honest accounting of the draft, the AFQT, Project 100,000, and the deferment system can describe as accidental. If you are a veteran of this war, particularly if you are a black veteran whose experience in either the field or the base camp or the homecoming has never been told in any record, that experience belongs in the comments. The oral history that Wallace Terry spent years collecting is irreplaceable, precisely because it came from the people who lived it. This channel makes the same argument. Primary testimony is evidence, and the historical record needs it. For everyone else, if this is not what you thought the Vietnam War story looked like, if the version you learned left this out, that omission is not accidental. The history of who fought, how they were sent there, what they came home to, and what the military did to them in the middle of it is a history that the standard narrative has been managing carefully for 50 years. Sources are in the description. Every statistic in this video is drawn from documented records. Share this if you think the full accounting matters. Subscribe for more of what the comfortable version leaves out. Thank you for watching. To the black soldiers who fought a double war and came home to a country that was slow to admit what it had done, this one was for you.